and welcome to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast. Each week we'll be joined by educational experts from across the globe who offer exclusive insights, inspiration and guidance that help practitioners unlock the potential for learning in the early years. Hello, my name is Alistair Bryce-Clegg and I'm your host for this week's TTS Talking Early Years podcast. I'm an early years consultant, trainer and author. Now, throughout this series, we will be discussing a range of topics that are aimed at supporting best practice in the early years and inspiring you with guidance and resources that will really enhance your practice. Hi, and welcome back to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Alistair Bryce-Clegg, and my guest, Neil Leitch. Now, we've done 3 of these episodes, Neil, so if you haven't listened to the other 3, go back and listen to them now because they're really good. And in this final one, I just want to have a little bit of a roundup of all the things we've talked about, try and end on a positive note, but also to start off with, just thinking about the language and communication gap, which is something that we have touched on in the previous episodes, because it is very prevalent within our space. Again, you said, and I know from the settings that I visit, it's the one thing that keeps coming up again and again and again as a key area to work on. Are there any things that you can think about that you've seen or initiatives that you're aware of that can really support our sector in trying to close that gap?
Well, again, it's about, for me, it's in talking with individuals who are at the sharp end of this. There is a common denominator, Alistair, that runs through all of that. And then it's time.
Yeah.
And the biggest problem that people face at this particular stage is that they don't have the time. They no longer feel they have the flexibility. Language and communication means engagement. It means attachment.
Yeah.
And if you are more concerned with numbers coming through the door than that individual child, then you will struggle. And honestly, without doubt, that's all I am hearing. I don't have the time to develop a one-to-one relationship with this child in the way in which I want to, I need to, and in the way in which I know will deliver results. And then that against, of course, a backdrop where we are seeing more and more children presented at early years settings with personal, social, and emotional development skills. And all of that, most of that predominantly, should I say, down to the fact of the pandemic.
Yeah. Children
lacked that ability to engage and to play with others. And now we're seeing the manifestation of that. And part of that is about language development. Perhaps they were in a very confined environment.
Yeah.
And language comes through sharing. It really does. You know it more than most, frankly. So
I think you're right. And also during the pandemic, as we've said in previous episodes, parents' attitudes changed. You had to work and try and school your children, or work and keep your children busy while you were working. And so again, that might be an increase in screen time, a lot less of that idea that you were meeting friends for play dates or even grandparents or whoever it may be in your community. So I think there is a definite, and there is research that backs up the fact that that changed during the pandemic and that we are seeing that as prevalent in our settings.
In terms of communication, just a very quick example of that was that I was asked by the chief executive of a large supermarket if I would give a talk at their annual conference. And I said, what about? And they said, well, how we can get mums back to work at the earliest opportunity. And I said, well, I'll talk about it, but let me talk to some of the colleagues that you're referring to, those that have returned and some of those that are still on maternity leave. And I kid you not, I spoke to 42 individuals. Not one individual was happy with the fact that they felt that they would use words like drag back, force back, whatever it happened to be, to work. And the common denominator that came through from all of that was the guilt that they felt because they no longer spent time engaging, communicating with their children. They would talk about, and many were in tears, Alistair, they would talk about how they came home from work at 5 o'clock in the evening. They spent an hour with their child. They would buy them more sweets. They would buy them more toys. And they would play with in the bath for maybe 20 minutes.
Yeah,
and that was it.
Yeah,
and so we shouldn't be surprised, that if you can't engage, if you haven't got the time to communicate, and at the moment we have this whole drive of mums should be working. They shouldn't be with their children. They should be back at work. supporting the economy. And we have to be very careful that we don't lose the parental role in all of this, I think, and the part that they play in effective communication with children.
Yeah, I think it's about choice, isn't it? There is not really a lot of choice. So you may choose to go back to work because that's what you want to do. But for lots of people who might not want to make that choice, they have to make it. And therefore you are, again, when we go back to the sector, if you're struggling to staff your setting, then you've got less staff to go around, or you've got staff that move around. So it's hard to get that kind of key person attachment. I think also settings need to be given permission to do it differently, to say, go with what you've got in front of you. And if you know that language and communication is an issue, then, somebody needs to say it's okay not to be pushing for those targets that you might have been asked to push for however long ago. This is about saying, this is what these children need. Let's do loads more play that's based around language and communication. Let's do it differently, because these children, not all of them, but the ones that we're talking about, are not yet at the stage where they are comfortable, engaged, ready to be doing that more kind of sedentary sitting and listening stuff. You need to be up and active and doing. But I think a lot of practitioners I talk to feel like, but if we did that and somebody came in and we weren't doing the days of the week, or if somebody came in and we weren't doing the whatever, then we would get chastised for that, because that's what helps children to move forward in their learning.
You use the word differently, which I think is absolutely critical. I was doing a podcast with Sarah Vine, who ex-wife of Michael Gove, and throughout the whole podcast there was this, and I don't mind saying this, but there was a whole tone about Sarah saying, well, if you have a child, it's your responsibility, you look after them, you care for them, you do this and you do that. Your point about the fact that when I was growing up, it was almost accepted, my eldest son is 51, it was accepted that you could survive on one salary, and rightly and wrongly it was the case. But he's 51. There's no way that him and his wife basically could have had a half decent life unless they were both working. Yeah. But it is about balance. But so Sarah's point was very much about get a grip, parent. It's your responsibility. And she said something that prompted me to respond to her by saying, and it comes back to the word different, there's a reason why somebody is called John and somebody is called James, and that is because every child is absolutely unique and every child's needs are different. And if we don't have the ability within an early year setting to be flexible, to recognize that, it is not all about churning out children that can count to 10 or can recite the alphabet, whatever it happens to be. It's about creating kind, gentle, empathetic citizens for the future, thinking about physical education, creativity, not just numbers and words. And so balance is important. And that's not an excuse for not intervening and not recognizing where there might be a need. But we're not in the role of, churning out factory children that all do the same thing.
Exactly. And I think as a workforce, it's empowering them to be able to recognize that. And if policy valued that, then we would be given the breathing space to do it. But policy values outcomes, not all policy, a lot of policy. And therefore, we are judged on those outcomes, and that is the pressure that filters its way all the way down. And even our very youngest children are susceptible to adults who are under pressure to have those academically recognized outcomes, when actually what you're saying is absolutely true, and especially linked in terms, of language and communication. Those key skills that make us effective human beings and communicators with each other, those dispositions for learning, those kind of attributes of character, they're the things that we should be focusing on. Which kind of takes us right back to the very beginning of our conversation in the very first episode. Yeah. Neil Leitch, has been an absolute pleasure to have you on the TTS Talking Early Years podcast. I know that you are really pressed for time because you've got lots of important people to speak to change policy.
I wish, Alistair.
It's all on your shoulders now, Neil. That's it. You're going to be the man that does it. But it's been an absolute pleasure to chat to you. Thank you very much for joining us. And if you are listening, don't forget there are 4 episodes in this series with Neil. Don't forget to listen to them all. Thanks again, Neil.
My pleasure, Alistair.
Well, Well, I'd just like to say a massive thank you to our guest Neil for joining us today and providing such valuable and interesting insights. You've been listening to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Alistair Bryce-Clegg, and Neil Leitch. Now, if you've been inspired by our conversation today, don't forget you can sign up via the link in our episode notes to be the first to hear about future episodes and also access exclusive follow-up content, which includes ideas for your setting and links to relevant resources.